next up, we have Dr. Adam Back. I'm sure everyone knows who he is, inventor of Hashcash, CEO of Blockstream, and according to some people, Satoshi. He'll be talking about miners versus nodes. And after that, he will also be on that mining panel. And later today, there will be also a fireside chat. So a lot of Adam content today. So Adam, if you could get on stage right now, that would be nice.
Okay, good. Yeah, it's just I had people talking in the background, but maybe that's just the organizers. So there we go. So let's summarize. Mining is doing lots of different interconnected things in Bitcoin. So one kind of straightforward one that most people are aware of is the coin distribution. So to somehow fairly distribute coins and put them into users' hands. So in the early days, anybody could mine using a CPU, then a GPU, later FPGAs and ASICs. So the miner is making an economic investment, obtaining coins, and then potentially selling or holding those. So it has the analogy with physical gold mining, for example. And that was first talked about in the context of Hashcash, I think, in April 1997. Somebody found a post recently as just a way to distribute coins in sort of prototype electronic cash systems. So another quite different thing about Bitcoin is that it's decentralized. Previous electronic cash systems were quite centralized. And that was actually what led to their downfall in a way. So there were protocols for providing strongly private coins with centralized databases where users could transfer coins around, and they would ultimately fail due to the centralization. So, for example, I have some probably on backup somewhere, some electronic cash coins from previous systems where the central database went offline when a company went out of business. So the fact that there's any centralizing component is an issue. So I think one advantage of Bitcoin, the mining activity in Bitcoin and the full node system is that the system is survivable. If any given business or miner leaves, other people can continue. So it has a kind of survivability benefit, which is distinct from the censorship resistance. And to go with that is distributed storage, so that as people join the network, they can catch up with history and verify history. So as well as that, there is the fact that mining is permissionless. So anybody can start mining to make the capital investment to buy the equipment, pay the electricity bills. And the fact that it's a distributed system with no central party helps Bitcoin to be permissionless, which is one of the important properties that distinguishes it from a legacy financial system, that there is no central party where you have to sign up or ask for permission to join or to create an account and so forth. So I think that the fact that mining is decentralized helps ensure that's the case. That remains the case. So another aspect of it is finality. So mining is building up sort of some permanence and increased cost over time of revising history. So that gives people confidence that their transactions become final over time. And it's also providing a kind of race condition arbitration, because when different miners are mining, occasionally several of them will find a block at almost the same time. And because it's a distributed system, you can't really tell who was first. And so at that point, there's a kind of protocol where miners just mine on top of what they saw first, and eventually one of the competing splits will pull ahead, and then that will be the new tip of the chain. So that's about race conditions, so-called Byzantine generals problem. It's a kind of coordination problem. So Bitcoin has de facto fungibility from the anonymous mining. The assumption is that while one miner could choose to not process a transaction in a block, another one will be happy to pick it up. And as they are not identified, they won't hesitate to generally mine your transaction. So if one miner doesn't, the next one probably will. And this is distinct from some sort of cryptography-based previous electronic cash systems where there was crypto fungibility, which is based on blind signatures and unlinkability. So those older systems have the property that miners can't, well, miners, I should say, block signers, because they had centralized or federated block signers. The block signers can't distinguish one transaction from another. And so that gives them fungibility just because they lack the hooks to impair fungibility. Their only choice is really to continue planning blocks or to stop, and then the network would stop progressing. So Bitcoin provides a kind of de facto fungibility. So just the assumption that people treat it as fungible, even though there's some linkage, there's some pseudonymous property of transactions. It's, in addition, not that clear which transactions belong to which wallet, particularly with change and coin joins and shared wallets. So many service providers have wallets that bundle coins of multiple users. So across all of those things, it starts to become obscure as to which coin belongs to which user. Okay. So another aspect that is talked about with mining is a kind of economic game theory. So I mentioned the Byzantine generals problem. So Bitcoin, one of the new things about Bitcoin, distinguishing it from previous kind of prototype idea stage electronic cash systems, starting with Hashcash and B-Money by Wei Dai and BitGold by Nick Szabo and RPAL, which is a reusable proof of work by Hal Finney, is that Bitcoin uses the proof of work itself to provide a new solution to the Byzantine generals problem. And the BGP problem is about sort of coordination, a consensus algorithm for reaching agreement on which set of transactions to process next in a distributed system with potentially untrusted parties. So that's where the game theory comes in, that the miners are economically incentivized up to the value of the subsidy or the freshly mined coins and the transaction fees to follow the correct most work chain. And users' full nodes are also verifying this. So that's partly what transmits the economics. So basically that ensures that attacking this system in the Sybil sense has a cost. Sybil problem affecting many peer-to-peer networks, just that in a system without identity, without coordinated clocks, people can construct denial of service attacks by making millions of sort of fake identities and making false announcements and so on. So proof of work adds a cost to proposing transactions to put into a next block. And another kind of, with the advent of ASICs, you have a kind of single purpose computer. So the computer, if the miners were to attack Bitcoin and impair its value ultimately, they're left with a single purpose piece of hardware which loses much of its value. So that aligns the incentives, the long-term incentives of miners with the security and robustness of the network. So I hinted at one thing there, which is that nodes are part of this picture too, and in fact, a very important and deciding part of the picture, which is while miners do verify blocks, in principle, they only do so because they know that users won't accept invalid blocks. And so users being people who transact, people who run full nodes and or rely on other people that run full nodes. And if there is a fork, as in a divergence in the rule set, so that there end up being two different versions of the network, users will vote economically. So they will decide which coin it is they value and ascribe that higher economic value. And generally speaking, what we've seen is that miners just follow whichever chain has the highest profitability, or the hash rate on sort of competing chains sharing a proof of work will tend to follow the same ratio as the value. So, and just, if they're mining the same number of coins per block and the same number of blocks in a day, then the hash rate tends to get distributed in proportion to the value that's been mined, including fees. And so, and that tends to be the case because economically, rationally, the miner can mine the chain that provides a higher reward and sell those coins and buy the coins that they prefer. So certainly it seems to have played out quite well. It's a very efficient piece of arbitrage in a market that miners will mine what's more profitable generally. But ultimately, it's the investors and users that enforce the rules because they're making an economic decision as to which coins to buy. And so, a large part of the crypto ecosystem is Bitcoin, and within the set of coins that are forked off from Bitcoin, a vast majority is Bitcoin itself, probably in the 97-98% range, and that means that the forks sharing the low hash rate tend to be relatively insecure. And the transmission method for the user's economic views is just they buy the coins and miners follow by the profit motive. And so I think that before the advent of forks of Bitcoin itself, or at least ones that reached public attention, it was less clear to some people what would happen in this advent. So there were some people who were previously thinking that miners were a big deciding factor in enforcing rules or in even deciding which chain is the correct sort of tip of the Bitcoin chain. And UASF event showed that really wasn't the case, that it was really down to the economics and the investors and the users and the service providers they used. So that played out, as a kind of very well for a sort of market theory of users deciding what they want to buy and service providers providing service to them. So now it's generally colloquially being said that Bitcoin is secure if 50% of the miners are honest. Actually, due to some more subtle game theory, it turns out to be only really secure if 33% or so are honest, and that's because some dishonest miners or miners that are sort of more intelligent about trying to gain advantage can partition the honest miners and so sort of pit 50% of them against the other 50% so they cancel out, leaving themselves as the winning miner. We haven't seen a 33% or selfish mining attack in the network, but it's shown to be the correct game theory. So an interesting question is what would happen if the majority of miners decided to attack the network in a way where they continue to collect the block reward, but, for example, they start censoring transactions, or they stop processing transactions, or something like that. So I think, you know, the first thing is that if they stop processing transactions, that would hurt value, and so they have that kind of meta incentive to not damage the value of their mining equipment, because the Bitcoin network needs transaction processing at some moderate scale to preserve value and confidence that people can transact when they need to. But I think that it's looking too shallow at the game theory to assume that if 50% or, you know, if the majority of the hash rate was trying to selectively stop transaction processing or stop transaction processing or impose some minor activated rule that users didn't approve of, that the users couldn't do anything about that, because, you know, as we just discussed with the user activated soft fork, ultimately it was an economic, the forks were an economic showdown and the economics won. So I think that means ultimately the miners would be unsuccessful at imposing a soft fork, even a soft fork rule change. You know, like they, just to give a silly example, that they wouldn't process transactions with even numbered addresses. They only allow through odd numbered addresses or something like that. So long as the users can detect that something is happening, that miners are partially or selectively censoring transactions or imposing an extra rule that is not part of the consensus rule that full nodes are run, then I think that the users can do something about that. They can economically veto an attack, is my claim. And you know, the simplest way they can do that is to coordinate out of band, just economically, to say that they don't like this, what's happening, and so they will agree with the service providers to invalidate some blocks which are perpetrating an attack. And, you know, assuming that coordination is actually relatively inexpensive, it's kind of economic activity, they can make a very costly situation for miners, because miners would be unable to, you know, they would lose the mining reward if the users chose to invalidate an attack. And you could see that the UASF itself was a bit like this, except it was you know, the miners kind of stopped at that point, but the user activated soft fork was basically the users in a grassroots movement modifying the software to only allow the blocks that had SegWit after a certain height to be considered valid. So the miners could either call that bluff or go along, and they went along, i.e. they did not interfere with that rule, even though that was a user-imposed rule at the last minute. So ultimately, holding is low cost and mining is costly. Yeah. So last slide. So what further can you do? So there are actually a couple more things that could be done. I proposed a protocol in 2013 called committed transactions, basically a kind of two-stage mining, where in the first stage is miners confirm transactions in a way where they can't see the details of transactions, and then those are revealed later. So that means that the miners are sort of denied the hooks. So it returns things more to the blind signature view, where you don't initially see what transactions are being finalized, that they get revealed later. And another concept is miners that don't go backwards. So it would be possible to make ASICs or firmware or mining pools and so on that generally want the block height to be the same or to increase. For an individual miner, there aren't, in a normal operation, situations where the block should be going backwards. Blocks going backwards in height is an indication of an attack generally. So they can refuse to participate. So that's the end of my talk. Thank you very much.